Welcome back to Becoming America. I'm Joellen Chatham, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Judge Jim Gray and the Honorable Bijan Kian. As you know, this series called Becoming America is about the Constitutional Convention of 1787 that drafted our Constitution. We have with us a special guest that I will introduce in detail a little more later, and that's the former President of the United States, James Madison, who's also known as the father of the Constitution. Each one of our sessions begins with a song from the new musical convention. These songs tell us about the Constitutional Convention and about the men that wrote the Constitution and the issues that they faced. One of the composers of convention is our own Judge Jim Gray, along with his co-composers, Steve Lawless and Joel Stein. Jim, the song today that we're going to listen to is If Men Were Angels. Can you tell us about that song? It's a pretended conversation between James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. What should we listen for?
Well, it's pretty much a one-way conversation, Dr. Joellen. I could take credit for a lot of lyrics, but a lot of the times I simply took these statements from the various people, in this case, President James Madison, and turned them into a song. At least the beginning of it is, and it's fairly well known, if men were angels, no government would be required, but they are not, and we are not, so in government we must be mired. And it goes forward. So this was truly the first experiment in self-government, really in the history of the world. And the delegates knew it. And of course, it wouldn't have happened but for our distinguished guest, President James Madison. He was behind the scenes, pulling the strings and bringing it all together. But and it was a huge deal. But Thomas Jefferson, who really had a lot more status, a lot more presence, was in France. And so he was complaining that, look, here, let's face it, this wouldn't happen without James Madison, but he had some self-doubts also. So how can this frail man fall upon me? I am but 5'4", epileptic, quiet, frail, and shy. I feel our group needs so much more. So of course he would have had second thoughts, because the weight of the world, the weight of the country was on him. So he was saying, Jefferson, oh Jefferson, why aren't you here? Why are you now in France? Why aren't you here now? And then they got into some of the issues on the song. So I'm proud of the song. I can't wait to have the opportunity to ask questions of James Madison, like you say, the father of the Constitution. We wouldn't be here as our country but for James Madison. So I just can't wait to listen to him, to get the word straight, and to ask him questions. But first, let's hear the song.
If men were angels, no government would be required. But they are not, and we are not, so in government we must be mired. But how can this fall upon me? I am but 5'4", epileptic, quiet, frail, and shy. I fear our group needs so much more. Jefferson, oh Jefferson, why can't you now be here? The burden now befalls on me, but the strain's too great, I fear. Jefferson, oh Jefferson, why can't you now be here? It's one thing to win our freedom, but where to now is not so clear. We tried to leave all power with each separate state, but Confederation, I must say, is not working out all that great. So now we sit in this room to create a more lasting find, and if we fail, we may well doom the fortunes of all mankind. Freedom of religion and to make one's own decisions are fundamental to the law. But strong government provisions with power to imprison, 'tis a balance hard to draw. Jefferson, oh Jefferson, why can't you be here now? What should we now prohibit and what should we now allow? Perhaps a Bill of Rights to protect us from government excesses. Oh, Tom, you wrote the Declaration of Independence. You have the structure. You have the following, and I don't. Of all the times, why are you now in France? Why aren't you here? Why aren't you here now? Jefferson, oh Jefferson, send your thoughts to me, I pray. For I can't fill our newborn country now that we've come this long, long way. If men were angels, no government would be required. But they are not, and we are not, so God, please let me be inspired. Jefferson, oh Jefferson, I need you now, you see. I have planned and coaxed and pushed ahead, but I can't see our destiny. Jefferson, oh Jefferson, this will take so much more than love. I'm sure for me to meet this task, I'll need guidance from above. Jefferson, oh Jefferson, this will take so much more than love. I'm sure for me to meet this task, I'll need guidance from above.
Jim, this song is great. It asks a lot of questions and brings up a lot of issues, but there's no one better to discuss those issues with us than the father of the Constitution, President James Madison. He was born in 1751 in the Piedmont region of Virginia. His father was a planter, had the same name, James Madison, and was a leader in the community and one of the wealthiest men in the community. James Madison was one of 12 children. He was the eldest, but only 6 actually survived through adulthood. He attended the College of New Jersey, which later became known as Princeton, and he stayed on an extra year to study Hebrew and political philosophy with the great leader, John Witherspoon, who was the president of the college. During the Revolutionary War, he was commissioned with the militia, but he spent his time helping to draft the Constitution of Virginia, looking out for the religious rights of Americans, and being active in the movement that led to the Constitution. He was a prime mover for the convening of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He spent months before the convention preparing for it, and was actually a leader in getting President, well, at the time, General George Washington to attend. Mr. Madison, President Madison, we welcome you. The year right now is 1821. And I've always wanted to interview a president of the United States and a founding father, and this is the opportunity. Thank you so much for being with us. You've been president of the United States. You were Secretary of State. You were a member of Congress, a member of the Confederation Congress, a delegate of the Constitutional Convention, known as the father of the Constitution. What are you doing these days? How are you spending your time in retirement?
Well, I've relished certainly the years that have been afforded me since 1817, when Mrs. Madison and I finally left the presidency and left Washington City. I have been actively engaged in trying to operate the farm more personally than I have been able to over the last 40 years. I have given considerable attention to the new University of Virginia that has been proposed. We have been working on a prospective university for Virginia for some number of years, and in close ties with Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Watson, Mr. Koch and Mr. Monroe and Mr. Tolliver in that endeavor. I have been reviewing my notes of the Constitution, received assistance from both my wife and my son, Payne, to revise those notes and to render them more clear, more comprehensible, and hopefully with the idea of vending those for the benefit of my wife after my passing. I have been involved in a copious correspondence with numerous individuals who are seeking to establish colleges and universities of their own right, issues regarding Brazil and the United States, and giving advice to Mr. Monroe on that. An active correspondence with Mr. Adams, John Quincy Adams, and also Mr. Rush regarding foreign affairs. I have been involved with many in matters of agriculture. And it's been quite the life has not been idle for me since the retirement.
Bijan, I think you have the first question.
Thank you, Mr. President. I get to ask the first question. In our series, Mr. President, we've studied the deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation and why it was important to amend them, as well as why the convention decided to create an entirely new document. You were instrumental, Mr. President, in that process. What was your role? And how did you prepare for such a complicated task?
It was evident at the time, after the war was over, that the association of states, their confederation of states, were inadequate to the needs that they all felt were requisite upon the national government. It is interesting to note that when the war was conducted, it was conducted by 13 independent sovereign states who were in league with one another in order to further their respective goals of independence. They recognized other facets of their unity with one another, but retained for themselves that plenary power, that element of sovereignty amongst each one of them, and agreed to work in a league to advance these national goals. The war was barely concluded with success on the basis of that confederation, and the years following the war gave copious evidence of the deficiencies of that national government. It was a league in which the states were a party by decisions of the states, and the sovereignties left with each one of the states. When it was proved deficient, and it was necessary to prove it deficient, I explored many historical representations of confederations: the Antiphonic League in Greece, the Lycian League, the Aegean League in Greece, the Kalmar League in Scandinavia, the Swiss cantons, the Dutch confederations. All of these were examples of confederations like our own, some more successful than others. And each demonstrated various virtues of their confederations and various defects. In analyzing those various conventions, it demonstrated that our own convention, the topography of our land, the nature of what we were, would be inadequate. The confederation form of government would be inadequate. That the needs of all the states were so requisite that it required a national government with the energy and the authority to act on national issues that no one state or group of states could address themselves. And as a consequence, a construction of a government and an acknowledgement of a national government with very limited powers to address those subjects and those areas which the states themselves were inept or incapable of addressing individually was necessary. This whole process then of a confederation based upon 13 sovereign states would have to be changed dramatically, and the concept of the sovereignty itself would have to be placed in the people at large, not as one consolidated government, but as the people represented in each one of the states. And the difficulty of proceeding with this attempt at a national government was to persuade state legislatures and state individuals of partial and partisan and provincial interest to rescind their claim to sovereignty in each one of the states and allow the sovereignty to be placed in the hands of the people at large, and remove the states as that element of sovereignty. But to so limit the national government to allow the states to retain that element of plenary powers over those issues which were not of a national character.
Mr. President, I'm embarrassed to say that we in our country now really do not understand the significance of Shays' rebellion in causing the revolution, causing the convention to come forward. What was that significance? Because that was an armed rebellion by former Revolutionary War troops, and they had been paid, etc. How important was that in getting people concerned enough to have the Constitutional Convention?
It occurred just previous to the convention, so its proximate time was very influential on many of the members. It indicated the deficiencies of, or the vulnerability of the states. When the war was concluded, Massachusetts and South Carolina had great difficulties, particularly Massachusetts, in satisfying the debts that they had incurred during the course of the war. And at the time, the Massachusetts Assembly had decided to try to tax the people. And they even imposed on the sheriffs of the time of each of the respective counties to collect those taxes. And if the sheriffs are not able to collect the taxes from the people generally, the sheriffs themselves would be held responsible for the monies they did not collect. There were other instances throughout the nation as well, the controversies amongst the states. There was the issue of the national tribes, of the Indian tribes in the West, and how that should be handled. The use of the lands west of the Mississippi, the presence of British troops on American soil that should have been removed with the treaty in 1783. There were a host of events, but the Shays Rebellion stands out as a very, very evident deficiency on the part of the government to control the dissatisfaction amongst the people.
You mentioned Rhode Island, and as we know, Rhode Island was the one state that refused to even attend the convention, and there was a lot of concern that the convention would even took place, would not be successful, and that was one of the reasons why George Washington was reluctant to attend. And it's our understanding that he attended the convention largely at your urging and that of General Henry Knox, and then was chosen to be president of the convention. What was your relationship like with George Washington, and not only at the convention, but over the years?
General Washington and I spent a great deal of time after the war in discussing matters in Virginia and about the nation at large. We had an active correspondence. I stayed at his home at Mount Vernon on several occasions, sometimes a week at a time. He insisted that I find a place of reprieve from the vicissitudes of politics that were taking place in the convention years, in the Confederation years. And we had an active conversation about the state of the nation at large. When it came time for to recognize the deficiencies of the Confederation, Mr. Hamilton from New York, you may have heard of his name, and I were most anxious to call a convention of the states to discuss the deficiencies of the Confederation and seek an amelioration to the difficulties and a strengthening of the powers and the authority of the national government under the Articles of Confederation. We sought to do this in 1786 and called a convention. It was held in Annapolis, but only five states sent deputies to that convention in September of 1786. And even though it was held in Annapolis, Maryland was not even party to that convention. They did not even send delegates to that convention. We met for a few days there, Mr. Hamilton and I, most ambitious to secure something more prominent, and sought for a national convention the following year in 1787. We recognized that because of the provincialities of the states, because of their ties to their own issues and their own concerns in their respective states, we needed to call a convention that would have the weight and authority that such a convention would require. And no one in the country represented that more in character than His Excellency General Washington at the time. He was above the political fray. He did not engage in the animadversions and the calumny and the invective and the vitriol that was present during much of that time. He was well regarded for his actions in 1783 when he resigned his commission as General of the Army. Very noble. I remember I was there at the time in Annapolis when that took place. It was a very solemn occasion in which he relinquished his sword to President Mifflin, President of the Confederation at that time. It was a very solemn experience and very moving. that a general so in command of so much, and perhaps of the only organization that was represented throughout most of the Union, would relinquish his position in that regard. So he held high esteem, and it cannot be diminished one iota, the high esteem that people held him above all other individuals. It was very necessary to get him to the convention. His presence alone would affect the respect that such a convention would require. Unfortunately, shortly before his attendance there, he had refused to attend because he was invited by the Society of Cincinnati to attend their national meeting in Philadelphia. He had been president at the time, and this is where Mr. Knox, who you mentioned, was very influential. Mr. Knox was also highly involved in the Society of Cincinnati. And when the society invited Mr. Washington to attend, His Excellency had refused, finding some reason to not be in attendance to the Society of Cincinnati. It was not going in the direction he felt it ought to go, but did not want to certainly exacerbate differences of opinion and so on, just sought a reason not to attend. So when the convention in Philadelphia is also called the Grand Convention, His Excellency was very reluctant to attend because he had just refused an invitation by the Society of Cincinnati to attend in the same city at the same time. So Mr. Hamilton and I had written to His Excellency, visited him to encourage him to attend. And also Henry Knox was influential because he in a sense, it gave a social permission to Mr. Washington to attend, to General Washington to attend, without compromising his situation with the Society of Cincinnati. Mr. Washington's sense of personal honor was so very high, and the very reason why he carried so much respect in the country, that any evidence of a snub before the Society of Cincinnati was to be highly discouraged and highly prevented. And so it was necessary to persuade Mr. Washington over his personal objections to attend, and it was very successful that he did.
Mr. President, you were a prime mover at the convention, and as you were preparing to go in, did you ever think about how people would react to the act of creating an entirely new document when the charter was to amend the existing Articles of Confederation? Did you ever think that people would say that Mr. Madison, the act of convening to create a new document was probably perceived as overthrowing the United States government?
Well, the convention had authority. It was called into being by the United States and Congress assembled under the Articles of Confederation. There was a consensus that the articles were deficient, and it was necessary to amend the nature of the government to address the issues in which that national government was deficient. The convention was called, it was allotted its own opportunity to set the rules of that convention, the privacy of conversations within, the deliberations thereof. It also was at liberty to render the government exigent to the needs of the people. And that is critical, because one of the fundamental deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation was the nature of the sovereignty, where it lay. And as long as the states exercise that sovereignty, that is, no other authority higher than the respective states themselves, there could be no progress in rendering greater energies or authority to the national government for collecting taxes, for settling disputes amongst states, for settling issues regards to foreign trade. Some of these states were sending respective ambassadors to foreign governments, to France or to Spain, to compete with one another for commercial advantage against some of the other states. This is not advantageous to the United States who's trying to settle a war debt.
It's known that at the convention, you took notes. The convention had decided that the meeting would be secret. Everybody knew what was happening, but they would not know what was going on inside of the State House because they wanted to allow the delegates to feel free to speak without being embarrassed by having the public know some of the ideas they might have brought up. But you took a seat very close to the dais where you could hear everyone. You took notes. So a couple of practical questions. One, all you had was pen and paper. How were you able to write so many notes? How did you decide what to cover, what not to cover, because you couldn't write every word? And do you plan someday to have your notes published, especially since the convention had decided to be secret? And with that, one little incident I'd like you to talk about too. Apparently one of the delegates was taking notes and so they were lost and someone found them and gave them to the president of the convention, George Washington. Could you mention that instance? But most important, what about your notes, how you took them, and do you plan to have them published someday?
Well, we had had a secretary, Mr. Thompson, who was selected to keep notes. I was acquainted with Charles Thompson before the convention, and thought it was it would be helpful, perhaps in the future, to have a record of what transpired in the convention. I was not the only one. Mr. Patterson and Mr. McHenry also kept notes. I think Mr. Hamilton also took some notes as well. If I recall, Mr. Pierce did from Georgia, Ambrose Bierce. And the record was difficult to retain. I did place myself on the table before the president of the convention, Mr. Washington, and was able to hear the recordation of, to make the recordation of what was said. It required a shorthand. It was very, very quick to do. Some of the speakers spoke very slowly. Those from the South were very easy to record because they spoke with a moderation in their voice. Those such as Mr. McHenry, Jared Ingersoll, Mr. Langdon from New Hampshire, Mr. Sherman, these gentlemen spoke with a rapidity that was a great challenge, of course, to write. But when the day was done, and generally the convention took place somewhere between 10 and 11 in the morning to 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And it was during that time that the notes were recorded. We often had meetings amongst committees before 10 o'clock in the morning and also after 3 or 4 in the afternoon. So it was not until around 6 or 7 o'clock at night when I was able to return to my room in Philadelphia and to record, to rewrite what I had written so quickly during the day. But even that rewriting of it was in abbreviated form. It was a struggle to retain it and also to retain a cognizance of what was actually being said. Sometimes the idea of writing down something that someone says is different than listening to what the person is saying at the time you're writing it. But it was a difficult challenge, to be sure. I was not unused to it from my college years, and thought the benefit would be much greater than the struggle to effect it. It took a great deal of time, and the reason why I'm now in my retirement, to be able to review those notes and to give some kind of a prosaic element to those cryptic notes that I had written at the time.
Well, will you publish them?
Well, I hope that they may be a foundation when I pass for Mrs. Madison. I'm hoping that the Congress will find them of value. Mr. Washington certainly did. Mr. Washington held on to the notes for some amount of time after the convention was there. We've exchanged correspondence. We had exchanged correspondence, and the substance of the notes have been requested on several occasions to allow the notes to be accessible to other individuals writing about the convention. But in a publication, I'm hoping that will be the event in the future, but not during my lifetime.
Mr. President, maybe in the now the truth be told department, and I don't mean to be impertinent, but there have been some people that said that since your notes were held for so long, and that many of the people, that most of the delegates were no longer around when they became disclosed, that you edited them, like you said, with the help of your son and I think your wife, but you kind of lost, you edged more toward making you look like you were really on the winning side each time, and kind of geared it a little bit in your favor for historical purposes. Did that happen at all, truth be told?
Well, I can certainly assert that people have objected to the impressions that were left after the convention, that my participation was larger than perhaps what it should have been properly construed to be. The Constitution is not the work of one individual, and it should be very strongly contradicted. It's the work of many heads and many hands working at a time. When one advocates a change in government, one cannot do it on their own. Even the likes of Mr. Washington could not effect such a change in a general sense over the nation about the nature of sovereignty. It is not for any one man to elevate himself above the others in attendance, to suggest it was his work more important than anyone else, or that the work itself was to be judged in a particular way so it would give advantage to one individual. This is the work of a nation and of a people and their representatives. And I eschew any attempt to suggest that I am trying to elevate my position in the annals of history, in the annals of mankind, by changing these notes to make myself look more favorable. There were many individuals involved in the most critical of situations, and I certainly would wish to give them as much credit as circumstances are due.
President James Madison, may I say from a different perspective that you are rightly considered to be the father of the Constitution, and I salute you for that. And also, by the way, you say many people did this, which is true, but in our world today, many people think, including me, that the delegates were divinely inspired to have been aware of the writings from Greece and Rome and Locke and Hobbes and Montesquieu and the rest. Do you not agree that those delegates were in effect divinely inspired to know so much about that and put together such a time-tested document? And I salute you again.
The divine representations prove themselves perhaps inadequate to the description. If one reviews the myriad of circumstances in which controversies arose, even in the convention itself, and the representation of large states and small states, equal representation in both houses, when one considers the very nature of creating a sovereign government based on the people instead of the states, the long litany of events that had taken place and the controversies that arose at each stage, whether it be the ratification stage in each state, the process of ratification in each state, the process of inviting individuals to attend a convention in which people did not think would be necessary, to the extraordinary effort exerted to prevent a second convention from being initiated by New York and Virginia alone, would indicate that perhaps the course of events were not so predestined as some people might like to wish them to be.
You talk about working with others and the important role of your colleagues. You authored together with Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Jay the Federalist Papers. How influential were they in the ratification process? And how did you get along specifically with Mr. Hamilton as you were writing the Federalist Papers?
Well, when the convention had concluded, actually even when it started, the convention started with 3 delegates from New York, Mr. Lansing and Mr. Yates and Mr. Hamilton. And by July 10th, if I'm not mistaken, because it was before the big the delegates, Mr. Yates and Mr. Lansing, who were also taking notes at the time, by the way of the convention while they were there, had left the convention because they did not like the direction in which the convention was taking. New York was a very successful state. Cows were fat and the fences were repaired and the grass was green in New York. They did not want to subject themselves to helping other states who were perhaps less efficacious in addressing their respective problems. So when New York sent representatives and deputies, in the form of Mr. Yates and Mr. Lansing, those representatives left, and leaving Mr. Hamilton, the single representative from New York. It took some time before he was the official representative. While he was there, he'd be the singular representative. And he was not in attendance throughout the whole convention by any means. But it was clear when the convention concluded that there were objections in New York. So New York was nearly 2-1 against ratifying the convention. It was pretty clear very quickly that New York would be in that position. And it was also the effort of New York to defer their ratifying convention until the March the following year in 1788, and Virginia's inclination to defer the convention to June 1788. Both parties, both advocates of the Constitution and those who were against ratification of the Constitution, thought there were advantages in deferring the conventions of New York and Virginia so far in advance to see how other states would respond to the convention. So it was necessary during that time to, Mr. Hamilton thought it was necessary to issue a number of papers that would explain the Constitution in itself. There's little accompanying description of how this new government would function, the nature of the sovereignty, the authority invested in it, the diffusion of authority vested in a new government. And a series of papers were commenced by Mr. Hamilton, along with Mr. Jay and Mr. Duane, I believe was the one that they had solicited, but Mr. Duane apparently had offered one paper and it was not satisfactorily received by Mr. Hamilton. So Mr. Hamilton then requested whether I might join that enterprise in writing about this new Constitution. There was not very much coordination between Mr. Hamilton and myself, a general disposition of subjects we might address. Some of them were redundant with one another. Some of the papers we somewhat had an opportunity to write together, although it was very rare. Mr. Hamilton lived near McLean's printing place, and just off Water Street, and I was on the Maiden Lane and about a block and a half from the printers that was to print these papers. And so we undertook that at a very rapid pace. Some of those instances I recall, I was in McLean's printing house and finishing a composition that he was already setting to type. And Mr. Hamilton did the same. So many of these papers were written with one draft involved. And it was an exercise, nothing like that, of writing notes during the Constitution, to write rapidly on subjects, to almost to unleashing within each of us our own perceptions of how this new government should work, and giving it a literary basis. And so we undertook that. I'm not sure how much influence it would have in New York, but by the time Virginia's convention had taken place, they were already published into 2 volumes. In the convention in Virginia, I believe 1 volume had been sent down, 25 copies of the 1 volume. The first volume had been sent. So it was not even a complete representation of both books that had arrived in Richmond when our ratifying convention began there in June of 1788. So it would mean perhaps a bit ingenuous on my part to suggest that the content of those papers had a great deal to do with the ratifications.
President, one of the issues that you say controversies that had to be set aside in order to create a more perfect union, one of those issues obviously was slavery. There were members of the convention who were absolutely opposed to slavery for a moral purpose. There were those who, in the South particularly, who defended slavery ardently. And then there were those who didn't see it as that important of an issue. And then there were people like yourself, Jefferson, Washington, who owned slaves, but you looked forward to the day when slavery would no longer exist because you didn't believe in slavery. How did you address that issue personally as a slave owner? And how did the convention deal with the issue of slavery?
Well, it was clear from the very beginning that there was a division between large states and small states, and also a division on the issue of slavery in the convention. We could not set aside the issues between the large and small states. We had to confront that during the convention in some fashion. And the results were not satisfactory to all parties involved, but it was. The issue of slavery, however, was a different story. And we sought in our pursuit, in our general pursuit of the convention, to preserve and perpetuate the union of the states. We knew that if we did not, that all the states would suffer at one point in the near future without a collective endeavor amongst all the states. And so that's the motivating factor to create a government that would survive. Issues that would get in the way, and particularly that of slavery, were omitted from the convention. The reference to slavery and so on was omitted. The idea of taking up the subject at all was left for 20 years to be in abeyance until 1808. And it might be regarded, certainly the Senate at the time in 1807, Secretary of State at the time, had already had the experience of Wilberforce in England and the abolition movement in England, and the prohibition of the international slave trade in England. And that helped to perpetuate the Senate in the fall of 1807 to initiate the prohibition of international slave trade by the 1st of January, which is the first day, really, that this could be effected according to the constitutional restrictions. So the issue was deferred in the issue of slavery. It has arisen on several occasions since that time. It's most prevalent now in the issue of the admission of the territory of Missouri into the Union. It would be perhaps impolitic on my part to engage in a complete discussion of the nature of this Missouri entering the Union and the fostering of dissension in this country about the number of slave states and free states, which really was not party to our national conversation until the admission of Missouri and the admission of Maine.
Mr. President, I know our time is short. First of all, what you just said, you had a surplus. I would vote for you today for president, but may I say thank you for being with us, sharing you with us. Thanks to your wife, Dolly Madison, for sharing you with us today as well. And I see that you're probably sitting at Montpelier at the moment. May I happily tell you that off in the distance, there will be a presidential library sitting right next to your home there for James Madison. So thank you for that. But as you know, the name of our show, the name of our conversation is Becoming America. America is a perfect idea. The United States of America is a work in progress. I think that still goes on in the 21st century, but do you subscribe to that? Did you see at the time that there were defects like slavery and other things, but you feel that it was a country was better for liberty in 1810 than it was in 1800, better in 1820, and to continue to progress? Are we still becoming America, and do you subscribe to that?
I very much so. The nature of Republican government, which we've established, representative government, is the very nature of the enterprise for people to govern themselves is an experiment always in progress. The issues that we addressed in 1787 were not resolved philosophically. We had to give answers, as each generation does, to the issues before us. But the answer did not construe a finality to answering these kinds of philosophical questions. The right, and when we can speak of all men are created equal, how did you interpret the word all? And if we talk about a representative democracy, how much is it a Republican democracy? How much is it Republican in nature, and how much is it democratic in nature? The issues of authority, the extent of national authority, all of these issues will be prevalent, and one can almost be assured of that in the coming years. It is not the kind of a series of events in which an answer is given in a mathematical sense that one can proceed to the next degree of depth of mathematics. It is a constancy. And I celebrate your inquiry in soliciting my humble advice on such matters, my humble observations on such matters. But it is through such endeavors that the issue is number one, kept alive because it is to be kept alive, the nature of an experiment. And also that people do not leave it feeling answers, but rather pursuing responses to perennial questions. And that is just the nature, it's contracted into a Republican form of government. And that's a real boon to society if they choose to accept continuing that discussion. And I celebrate your endeavors to do so.
As Judge Gray mentioned, we're just about out of time, so I'm going to ask the last question. And it's pertaining to this concept of becoming America and expansion of rights. There was talk, particularly during the ratification period, that a major deficit of the Constitution was that it did not provide a Bill of Rights. You, Alexander Hamilton, and others didn't feel it was necessary. And yet, when the first Congress met, you were a member of that first Congress, and you were the ones who ended up drafting the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, although you proposed 12. Can you explain why initially you thought it was unnecessary, and yet as a member of the Congress, you really are the author of not just the Constitution in many respects, but of the Bill of Rights?
I want to answer this quickly and to be brief about it. At the time the convention was taking place in the early years after the war was over, after the revolution was over, there's a growing sentiment in the states fostered by the British presence and coming from states from being colonies, that there were natural rights inherent in a people. This is different than the Bill of Rights as presented in 1689 in England. It has an entirely different foundation. It is to suggest that there are natural rights that are inherent with the people even before they form any government over themselves, and that these rights ought to be acknowledged and recognized. The problem is that in writing them, you suggest that you're confronting a government of plenary authority that will abuse those rights. Well, the only governments that had plenary authority at the time were the state governments. And when we seek to form a national government with limited authority, it has no authority but what it is issued, so that it cannot claim plenary authority to intrude upon the rights of the people. Secondly, one would suggest that to enumerate rights are going to be difficult because there are many rights, and if they're not enumerated in their entirety, it will presume that anything left out of such a list would be given to the national government. Thirdly, the language in trying to express the right. One finds a diminution of the claim to the right as the language describes the right. It has an inherent deficiency in describing the full length and breadth of the right being declared. And so to be against the Bill of Rights in the first place in 1787, I thought it was unnecessary because we were forming a limited government at the national level. Any such Bill of Rights should be issued before the states. That the language itself could not be an enumeration. If there's going to be a Bill of Rights, it has to be a prohibition of what the government cannot do to certain rights, without necessarily precluding other rights on which the government cannot obtrude. The language itself is eased when you place a prohibition on the government rather than when you enumerate the rights themselves. It was initiated in 1789 on my part, because it was clear after the revolution, after the convention was over, that many people still harbored suggestions of illegitimacy on the part of the new national government because such a Bill of Rights was not declared. And that's why I sought to initiate the Bill of Rights in the Congress. There was great opposition in the Congress to do this. We have the government. The Congress says, why should we undertake this new Bill of Rights? There are many things to suggest on that subject. Essentially, it was not necessary because the national government did not have the rights to the authority to obtrude upon personal rights. And we included a Bill of Rights afterwards because it would give greater a sense of legitimacy to the people of the government, and also extend to such judges as yourselves an authority to address issues of a jurisprudential nature, where other resolutions or other methods of resolving court cases might not be efficient. It inculcates in the American people generally that these rights exist, and over a period of time they will obtain weight just by their mere force. Although as a paper document, it has no authority in itself. It does inculcate in the American people the sense that these rights exist, and I suspect they'll be fighting for them at some point in the near future.
I think you're absolutely right. Mr. Madison, on behalf of my colleagues, Bijan Kian and Jim Gray, this has been a distinct honor for us to interview you, to learn from you personally, some of the contributions you've made to this country. And we will be forever in your debt, not only as a nation, but this Constitution has been copied around the world by other countries seeking freedom and representative government. So this debt is owned by us to you internationally as well as nationally. And for our viewers, I hope you enjoyed this segment. Our next episode will be with Dr. William Barclay Allen, who is a political science professor, but also the former chairman of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. And he will bring a wealth of knowledge to us as well. If you enjoyed today's session, and especially the song, you can go to judgejimgray.com and listen to the song again. And you can listen to all of the songs because they're recorded on that website. And if you would like to learn a day-by-day account of what happened at the Constitutional Convention, by the way, based largely on James Madison's notes, just go to Concordia University Irvine Center for Public Policy, and the blog will pop up, and it takes you about 4 to 5 minutes to read a daily summary of what happened at the Constitutional Convention. We'll see you next time, and thank you so much. And President James Madison, God bless. We're so glad to have had you.
Thank you, indeed.